Hey, good afternoon. Bill O'Leary, um, attorney here at Legacy Planning Law Group, coming to you live this Thursday as part of our Thirsty Thursday series. Good day to you. For those that maybe are checking in for the first time, this is a weekly thing that we're doing. Every Thursday at about this time, I'm going live on Facebook to talk about a different topic. It changes from week to week. Topics that relate to sort of what I do as an attorney in my firm, Legacy Planning Law Group, estate planning, wills and trusts and estates and that sort of thing, and elder law, basically estate planning for our seniors. Sometimes we'll talk about, what happens if a loved one dies and they didn't plan as well as they could, sort of what the family is going to have to then, sort of the journey they're going to have to go on to administer the estate. So again, different topic each week. So, what is today's topic? Do you own a gun? Well, if you do, be careful. You might need a gun trust. So we're going to talk about gun trust, okay? So let me ask you this. Do you ever wonder, what's going to happen if you happen to own firearms? What's going to happen when you die and how they're going to be passed on? Because I can tell you, make a mistake inheriting a gun collection and there's a chance you could face felony charges under federal law. So anyone who owns a firearm might want to consider adding a gun trust to their estate plan to avoid that felony possibility. Gun trusts, they're used for firearms that are subject to strict federal and state regulation, but they also are great tools for other kinds of firearms. The vast majority of firearms that are not that highly regulated. So in a nutshell, gun trust makes it easier to handle firearms after the owner's death, and it may protect the surviving family members from inadvertently violating the law and committing a felony. So, a little bit of background I think would be helpful first. I want to talk briefly about two particular laws that apply. Number one is is called the NFA, the National Firearms Act. This law deals with NFA firearms. Sometimes they're also known as Title II weapons or Class 3 weapons. I like to call this the big stuff. Okay, so automatic weapons like a machine gun or maybe a short barrel weapon. I think of a short barrel or sawed-off shotgun or rifle. Silencers, suppressors, explosive devices. These are the kind of firearms that are sort of governed by the National Firearms Act. It's a law that's been around for a long time. It goes back to the 1930s, but it's still relevant today. Now, under this law, ownership of this kind of firearm, it's not illegal, but it's highly regulated. And here is sort of where the rubber meets the road. Only the owner can possess that firearm. Nobody else can. Nobody else can possess the firearm, whether intentionally or whether constructively. So there's something called actual possession. I'm holding it in my hands. But there's also something in the law called constructive possession. I may not be holding it in my hands, but I am deemed to sort of constructively possess it because I may have access to it. Think of you owning this type of firearm and you put it in the trunk of your car and it's not secure and your wife is riding in the passenger seat. She's deemed to have constructive possession. That's a problem. That's a big problem. Or it's in the house, but it's not securely locked. And your wife and your family are living under the same roof. They have constructive possession. Major problem. What's the problem? They have committed a felony. Inadvertently, we like to call it an inadvertent felony. And what is that? What's the punishment there? 10 years, $250,000 fine, and oh, by the way, the firearms are forfeited. So again, I like to call it an inadvertent felony. So that is a little background on the first of the two laws I want to talk about, the National Firearms Act. The second law is called the Gun Control Act, and this goes back to the 1960s, but again, still very applicable today. This covers all firearms. The National Firearms Act covers sort of the big stuff. The Gun Control Act applies to all firearms, and both of these laws sort of work in tandem. Well, the principal thrust of the Gun Control Act is that certain types of people are not allowed to own a firearm of any type, whether it's a handgun, the hunting rifle, whatever it might be. There are certain types of people that fall under the category of a prohibited person. Well, let me just run through the list of who some of these are. And some of these might sort of seem self-evident to you, but others may not. Somebody convicted of a felony or even indicted of a felony that's punishable by more than 1 year in prison, or a state law misdemeanor punishable by 2 years or more in prison. Somebody convicted of a felony or a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence or child abuse is a prohibited person, not allowed to own a firearm. Somebody adjudicated to be mentally defective, that's sort of outdated terminology, but it's still in the law, mentally defective or committed to some sort of mental institution. A veteran who was dishonorably discharged, not allowed to own a firearm. Illegal alien, not allowed. Somebody that is subject to a restraining order for harassing, stalking, or threatening an intimate partner or a child of an intimate partner. Here's one that gets people. A habitual user of controlled substances is a prohibited person. Well, what is a controlled substance under federal law? Marijuana. You've heard of different states legalizing marijuana. Still, under federal statute, marijuana is a controlled substance, is illegal. So you have a habitual, a pot smoker, not allowed to own a firearm. You think they know that? Probably not. And somebody on probation is not allowed to own a firearm. On probation, including for misdemeanors and DUI. So again, certain types of people are prohibited persons, not allowed to own a firearm. And then one more sort of law I'm going to address real quick is it's actually a regulation put out by ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. It's called Rule 41F. And here, sort of the thrust of that is that each time a firearm is transferred, an application must be filled out called Form 4. And as part of that, a sort of a new requirement that came into place several years back, a questionnaire has to be filled out by a responsible person, or the owner of the firearm is a responsible person. If we're talking about the use of a gun trust, which I'm going to explain in a minute, a responsible person also includes the person that sets up the trust, as well as the trustees of the trust. Okay? In addition, ATF requires photographs, fingerprints, and a background check. And then the last sort of general requirement that the ATF imposes is you've got to notify what's called the Chief Law Enforcement Officer, CLEO, CLEO. So let's say, in Jacksonville, that would be the sheriff. They've got to notify. The rule was changed several years ago for the better, because the old rule used to be not only did you need to notify the Chief Law Enforcement Officer, but needed to get their approval. What was happening is that these law enforcement officers were basically sitting on these requests for approval. Well, they've sort of streamlined that to say, now all you have to do is notify, but you don't need to get approval. Now, let's talk about gun trust. What are some of the advantages of using a gun trust? And again, when you think of a trust, think of nothing but a box. That's all a trust is a box. You're building a box, and you're deciding as part of that box 4 very important questions. Who gets your stuff? What they get, when they get it, and how they get it. Okay? Well, as part of building a trust, of building a box, an important step is putting your assets into the trust. So if we're talking about a trust that we do commonly for estate planning purposes, we might put a house into the trust. We might put a bank account or an investment account into the trust, into the box. With a gun trust, what we're talking about is putting the firearms into the trust, the firearms into the box. So what are some advantages of a gun trust? It is private. Nobody will know how many firearms are owned by the trust. Nobody has a right to know what while you're alive, and when you pass away, nobody has a right to know except the beneficiaries that you named, but nobody else has a right to know, including the government. In addition, the trust can hold multiple firearms. You can have as many firearms in a single trust as you'd like. What happens when you die? Those firearms will pass to your loved ones without having to get stuck in the probate court. So they'll pass smoothly and easily. And oh, by the way, the nice thing about staying out of probate is it remains private. Anytime an estate has to go through probate, it's public record. And I'm sure the last thing you would want if you own firearms is for the world to know how many firearms you had. It also avoids the need for somebody in your family to go running to the court system if you become incapacitated. You're still alive, you become incapacitated, to go get a guardianship for you. Again, that's very public. Everyone will know the firearms that you own. Things remain private if you become incapacitated. And a gun trust also avoids what I like to call a post-death risk. So let's go back to that concept of a prohibited person. You may name as the executor of your estate, let's say, under your will or whatnot, if you don't have a gun trust, but let's say you just have a will, you may name, I don't know, your spouse as your executor. Well, what if your spouse is not a gun enthusiast and doesn't understand the gun laws? Frankly, doesn't want to know about the gun laws. And that means your spouse doesn't understand the concept of a prohibited person. Okay? And let's say that under your will, you are giving your firearms to your nephew, Johnny. Okay? And let's say at that time, Johnny is on probation for a DUI or is a habitual marijuana smoker. Prohibited person, not allowed to receive the firearm that you want to give to him under the will. Well, guess who doesn't know that? Your spouse as the executor doesn't know that, and Johnny, your nephew, doesn't know that. And so then your spouse passes the firearms through the will to Johnny. Well, guess what happens? Both have committed an inadvertent felony, 10 years, $250,000 in forfeiture of the firearms. Okay? Even beyond that, let's say that they are aware of the gun laws and understands the prohibited person, but let's say Johnny may not be mature or responsible quite yet. Well, if everything is going to the will, he has a right to get it, whether he's responsible or not. Okay? What a gun trust can do is to say, if at that time, which is at my death, and I have said I want my firearms to go to my nephew Johnny, if at that time Johnny is a prohibited person, so he's smoking pot or he's on probation for a DUI, that my person in charge of the trust, called the trustee, is absolutely forbidden from transferring that firearm to Johnny. The trust basically says it's as if Johnny died before I did and Johnny doesn't exist anymore. So it's a way to protect, let's say, your spouse, who may be the trustee after you, as well as Johnny, the beneficiary. Okay? So that's a great use of a sort of a gun trust, is that sort of that post-death risk of committing that inadvertent felony. Another advantage of a gun trust, and here we're going to focus specifically on the NFA firearm, the big stuff, okay? Remember, a big sort of a rule that says only the owner can possess the firearm. Well, if we were to use a gun trust to own the firearm, we can have more than one person possess the firearm, because no longer do you own it in your own name where you're the only person that's allowed to possess it, but instead now the trust owns the firearm. And so basically you can add people to the trust as trustees, is sort of the way we do it. And if they are a trustee, they're allowed to possess the firearm. And what we often do is we'll have our client, it's very flexible. Maybe if they want somebody to be able to possess that firearm, they will, add them as trustee on a Friday, and it's going to be a weekend, hunting trip, let's say. And then at the end of the weekend, the following Monday, they remove them as trustee. So this person only has the right to possess it for a short period of time. In addition, again, it allows continuity of death. So if you don't have a gun trust, okay, if um, if the firearm is to be transferred to death, there's certain transfer requirements that ATF is going to require be fulfilled. Those can be avoided with a gun trust. Avoided with a gun trust. Again, a smooth and easy transfer. And then one last advantage of a gun trust, and this actually applies to all firearms. So really, the vast majority of firearms that people own. So imagine this: that you decide to go to the range, and you want to bring a friend with you, and let your friend use your firearm at the range or hunting. And so you're basically loaning your firearm to them, and let's say they're careless with it, and they end up injuring somebody. Well, if you don't have a gun trust, but you just own those firearms yourself and you loan them in that way, you can have liability for loaning that out. It's called negligent entrustment of a firearm, and then your personal assets could be at risk if you ever get sued. If instead you have a gun trust and put your firearms in the gun trust, and then you, as the trustee, will allow somebody else to use that firearm, and they are careless or negligent with it and injure somebody, even if a lawsuit is brought, the only assets that that injured party can collect to satisfy any claim that they have or judgment are the assets of the trust, because the firearm, they can only go after the owner of the firearm. The owner is no longer you, but it's your trust, you see. So yeah, your firearms would be at risk of being sort of attached to satisfy a judgment, but all of your personal assets are not. So that's sort of a lifetime risk that a gun trust addresses. In terms of how we sort of put together gun trusts, we actually have 3 different levels of our gun trust, and we sort of color code them. We call it the bronze level, the silver level, and the gold level. The bronze level, we don't do this that often because this is sort of this is a single purpose trust, and it's just designed to handle NFA firearms. And most people don't have NFA firearms. So it's the silver level and then the gold that most of our clients that elect to get a gun trust consider. A silver gun trust is able to accommodate both NFA firearms and non-NFA firearms, so the vast majority of firearms. But with a silver trust, at your death, the firearms are distributed directly. They're distributed outright and the trust is closed down. The gold trust, on the other hand, is just like the silver. It can accommodate NFA and non-NFA firearms. However, it doesn't end at your death, but the trust continues on, and that's really designed for people that really want to sort of really pass on a legacy, and we can call it like the Smith Armory that is passed on to the next generation, but it stays in a trust as a way to protect the next generation from those same risks. Okay. And the last point I'll make is, you may say, well, why would you need a gun trust? I have a trust, a revocable living trust, kind of trust that's done very commonly. I have a revocable trust. Isn't that good enough? I'll just put my firearms into that. And the answer is no. That is not going to work, because in all likelihood it does not have the sort of specific instructions, the specific verbiage that we put in a gun trust. The revocable trust does not have that, because it doesn't have those instructions on how a firearm is to be possessed or transferred. Number one. Number two, there's a common sort of set of verbiage in a revocable living trust that addresses how the money or the assets of the trust are distributed out. We call it a distribution standard, and a common distribution standard is that it says that principal is to be distributed for health, education, maintenance, and support of the beneficiary. Well, that standard in and of itself can violate the National Firearms Act. And then lastly, with a revocable living trust, the person that establishes the trust, what we call the grantor or the settlor or maybe the trust maker, these words mean the same thing, they can revoke it. Well, what if they were to revoke the trust and that revocation caused an illegal transfer of a firearm, a gun trust will prevent that from happening. So there are lots of advantages to a gun trust, and again, it's even if you don't have sort of the big stuff, but you've got the 98% of the firearms that are out there, the gun trust really, sort of, if you boil down to it, can help sort of satisfy two considerations. One, the lifetime risk. You loan your firearm to someone else and they misuse it, and now you're getting sued for negligent entrusting that firearm to someone else, and your personal assets are at risk. And secondly, the sort of the risk that exists after death, and to make sure that your loved one that's going to handle your estate, as well as the beneficiary that's going to be receiving the firearm, protecting them from committing an inadvertent felony. So, hey, look, if you'd like to know more about gun trusts and maybe how we can help, we'd love to talk to you. You can book a free 15-minute discovery phone call with us. Just hit the book now button on our Facebook page, or just Google us, legacyplanninglawgroup.com. So hey, if you've enjoyed this video, if you could like it, trying to get the word out, just like the video. Really appreciate it. Better yet, share it with your friends, your Facebook friends. Again, just trying to get the word out. So I hope you've enjoyed this talk, which is entitled "Own a Gun? Be Careful, You Might Need a Gun Trust." As I said at the beginning, I plan on giving another Facebook Live talk next Thursday at about this time, same day, same time, just a different topic. So if you're thirsting for knowledge, you've come to the right place. So Bill O'Leary signing off on behalf of everyone here at Team Legacy. Go make it a great day.